As you just heard, this meeting is going to be recorded during the presentation and Q&A pieces. My name is Joanna Jansen, and I'm a consultant with the city working for PlaceWorks, the lead consultant on the general plan update. And I'm going to let the city staff introduce themselves now with Zach Dahl. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Joanna. And thanks for everyone for joining us here on a Saturday to learn more about our general plan update process. As I noted, my name is Zach Dahl. I'm Deputy Director of Community Development with the City of San Mateo and project lead for the city on this general plan update process. We have a number of other staff members here, both with PlaceWorks and with city staff. So we can go around and do a quick introduction for everybody here before we get started.
I can go first. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Linda Lee. I'm an associate planner, and I'll be facilitating one of the breakout groups later at the end of this meeting. Thanks.
Perfect. Well, and we do have a number of PlaceWorks staffs as well, but we can go ahead and get started with the presentation. Before I hand it off to Joanna, we've started the next phase of our general plan update process, which is really doing a technical analysis and deep dive into comparing our three land use and circulation alternatives that are under consideration. And this process will ultimately culminate in the City Council with input from our Planning Commission, our General Plan Subcommittee, and most importantly, all of the members of our community on what is the most appropriate land use scenario and circulation scenario that the city should plan for the next 20 years. So with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Joanna, who can start the presentation and give us an overview of what we're looking at here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Zach. As we're getting started here, it's always important for us to understand who's here with us and also who's maybe not here, then not represented. So if you've been joining us for some of these meetings before, you know that often early on in the meeting, we do just a quick poll to find out a little bit of information about you. And so we're going to go ahead and launch that poll now right here within Zoom. So you'll see some questions come up on your screen. The consultant team and city staff are not answering these questions. We just want to hear from stakeholders and members of the community who are here with us today. So we'll give you a minute to answer these questions and get a sense of who's in this virtual room with us today. Thanks so much. Appreciate all these responses coming in. This is great. Responses are slowing down here, so you can see these on your screen as well, but it looks like we have about 19 people out of 32 who've responded so far that are here for the first general plan event. That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining this process. The first presentation that I do in just a few minutes is to orient you a little bit to what the general plan is and give you some foundation for understanding at this first meeting. Most people here are identifying themselves as residents of San Mateo, which is great. And we do have both people who rent and people who work in San Mateo, as well as a couple people who own a business. Many of you own property in San Mateo, visit San Mateo businesses, represent community groups or homeowners associations or other types of organizations here in San Mateo, which has a wealth of very active and engaged organizations. So thank you so much again for sharing a little bit of information about yourselves. This really helps us understand who we're reaching. And again, if there's folks we're not reaching and need to do a better job of. So with that, we're going to go ahead and end the poll. And thank you again. And with that, I'm going to share my screen and walk through Just a relatively brief presentation. Give me one moment, please, to set up the screen share. Let's see here. Hang on. I'm going to stop and straighten that out. This is a several step process, so I appreciate your patience. We'll be right back to the presentation here. Well, that did not work the way that I thought it would. That's right. Thanks, you guys. I apologize for the delay here. Oops. It's not been so troublesome. There we go. All right. Thanks again. Sorry about that awkwardness. You're here for the preferred scenario workshop, as Zach mentioned, and we've done our welcome and introductions and our icebreaker exercise, so we're well along. As I said, I'm going to give first an overview of the general plan and what it is. Then we're going to have some time for questions and answers and some interactive polling with you in a little bit of a different format from the one we just did. Then I'm going to give you an overview of what we call the alternatives evaluation and another chance for questions and answers and interactive polling. So we're slated to wrap up around 11:30 today. If there's some of you here who want to spend a little bit more time going in depth, we have an optional small group feedback session following the presentations and the Q&A. So that'll start around 11:30 and we have about 30 minutes for that. And again, that's entirely optional. If you choose to spend a little bit more time, you're welcome to, but you don't have to. So always when we gather, we want to provide an inclusive and informed dialogue so that you understand potential future changes in San Mateo and can react to those. We want to share with you a sense of possibilities for the future of San Mateo. We want to inform you and help you understand the outcomes of the alternatives evaluation, which I'll explain, and get your feedback based on that information about a potential preferred scenario. And as always, want you to understand that this is one step today in a much larger process, and there's many different opportunities for input from you and from others. As we go through the presentation, as I mentioned, you may have questions and we're going to have time to answer those questions. So if things are coming up for you, please use the chat function to send questions. Those will go to my colleague, Carrie Stone at Placeworks, who will help facilitate the Q&A when we get there in a few minutes. So if you need to access the chat window to submit a question, there's a little kind of dialog box at the bottom of your screen. And then you can type your message there. In case you're having any issues with Zoom, I think many of us are pretty familiar with it by this point, but just in case you're having any technical difficulties, we also have a Placeworks staff member, Angelica, who's standing by to help with Zoom technical questions. And so she's named Zoom questions if you have any questions about the interface specifically. So any questions about the project, please send them to Carrie, and she will be our clearinghouse to make sure everything gets answered. So as I said, I'm going to start off by explaining the general plan itself. The general plan is a very powerful document because it guides the future growth and development decisions. Every city and county in California is required to have one, and San Mateo is no exception. The general plan covers land use and transportation, urban design issues, open space conservation, public safety from natural hazards and climate change. And it's a very important document in setting the overall direction for the city. So that's part of why it's so important to get your input and a broad range of input on the plan, because it affects so many different aspects of life in San Mateo. It's further implemented through what we call specific plans, which might give more in-depth guidance for individual areas of San Mateo. And then of course, through the zoning code, which you might have heard of if you've wanted to do an addition to your home or open a business. or create a parklet in your neighborhood. The zoning code is the place where there's even more detail about specific development on individual sites, how tall a building can be, how close it can be to the property line, what kind of lighting or trash enclosures might be required, and those kinds of details. So the general plan and the zoning code are two different things, but they work together. And the provisions of the zoning code actually are based on and come from the general plan. So the general plan, again, is that very foundational document setting the direction for the city. A couple of years ago, earlier on in this process, we worked with the community, the general plan subcommittee, the planning commission, and the city council to create a vision statement to guide our work on the general plan. And since that time, we like to refer to this vision statement at the outset of all our general plan meetings, just to remind ourselves of what we've established for our vision. And it says that San Mateo is a vibrant, livable, diverse, and healthy community that respects the quality of its neighborhoods, fosters a flourishing economy, is committed to equity, and is a leader in environmental sustainability. And that vision statement is supported by 5 values of diversity, balance, inclusivity, prosperity, and resiliency. And each one of those values has some more detail in the full statement, but I'm not going to go into that here. So this is the vision and the values that the general plan is intended to embody and uphold. And part of what we're going to be talking about today is what are different possible ways of implementing and arriving at that vision. So let me just briefly show you where we are in this process. As I mentioned, it's been going on for a little while. We've been in the alternatives phase, and that's still where we are. The general plan is shown in the top orange bar on this slide. And we're in the phase of evaluating alternatives and creating a preferred scenario. And I'm going to explain more about that. After we have a preferred scenario, we're going to be developing the goals, policies, and actions that are the basis of the regulations in the general plan. That will be out for public review later in 2022 and into 2023. And then in the second half of 2023, we'll be moving into the final adoption phase, which will also include an environmental impact report, or EIR, that looks at the potential physical impacts of the general plan. Some of this is happening in parallel with the housing element, which you may be familiar with in San Mateo. That's shown on the green bar on the lower half of the slide. The housing element is a chapter of the general plan, but it's subject to very specific state requirements that mean it needs to happen on a separate and parallel schedule. So that is shown here. And the draft housing element will be, which plans for future housing supply in San Mateo for people at all income levels. That will be adopted separately from and earlier than the rest of the general plan, no later than January 2023. These projects are related and interconnected, and we're coordinating with the housing element team to make sure that we remain consistent and integrated. We are always mindful of all of the community feedback that we've heard so far, very, very valuable to us, and the additional feedback that you share here today will be added to this. We've heard consistently that people are concerned about traffic congestion and traffic safety, the need for affordable housing in San Mateo, a desire for transit improvements, as well as improvements to sidewalks and crosswalks and street lighting to make it safer to walk in San Mateo. Concerns about the supply of on-street parking, and also a concern that community events and activities and parks remain at the center of community life in San Mateo and continue to fulfill their very important role in community spirit. So with that, let me explain a little bit about the alternatives process that we've been going through. One very important part of the general plan is the land use map. The colors or the designations on this map, which your current map is shown here on this slide, determine what can be built where and at what intensity. So this has a very, very powerful effect on what someone can build on their own property, or perhaps what can be built on a property near you. So considering changes to this map is a very deliberate process. We started by choosing study areas in San Mateo that are most likely to experience change. And then we worked with the community to explore a range of possible alternatives within those study areas, which are shown on the map on the right. We finalized those alternatives, and now we have completed a step of evaluating and comparing those alternatives within the 10 study areas. So we're going to share those outcomes with you today and ask you to start the process of mixing and matching to create what we call a preferred scenario. That preferred scenario will then become the basis for potential changes to the general plan land use map, and then also transportation improvements that need to be planned to support whatever that future land use map looks like. The draft land use alternatives that we came up with primarily differ in their residential development. This was probably the top concern that we heard over the past couple of years and working with the San Mateo community was, what's the appropriate amount of housing that San Mateo should be planning for, and where should it be located and what should it look like? So these alternatives really focus on distinguishing among options for that. Alternative A would add about 11,800 new homes. Alternative B would add about 16,000 new homes. And alternative C would add about 21,000 new homes. That's all compared to about 39,000 homes in San Mateo today. And so obviously those have related population increases. As you can see from this table, all of three alternatives would add about 15,000 jobs to San Mateo. So they have similar job growth across the three alternatives, but different residential growth kind of from low to high from A, B, and C. These three maps kind of show how that looks like. Obviously, you can't read these maps at this scale. I understand that. But this just is intended to show you kind of conceptually how the three alternatives are slightly different within each one of the 10 study areas. And the alternatives do focus on these individual areas because we think they're the most likely places to change. As you can see, most of them are kind of along the El Camino corridor or other major corridors and near Caltrain stations or other places that are likely to change in the next 20 years. Areas outside of the study areas are covered by the general plan. The general plan covers the entire city, and areas outside of the study areas can change over the next 20 years. But we don't expect them to see as intensive of change as the study areas. So I mentioned the housing element earlier, and it's a very important legally required component of the general plan, and it has to be reviewed and approved by the state of California. It's the only general plan element that has to meet that requirement. So in order to be what we call certified by the state, the housing element needs to identify sites to accommodate over 7,000 new units, as well as a buffer of additional units. All of the study areas except the northernmost part of El Camino Real have some sites that the housing element process has so far identified as potential housing sites. Therefore, all of the housing sites from the housing element, the draft housing element process that's underway are designated residential medium or residential high, or in some cases mixed use medium or high, in order to allow multifamily housing consistent with the housing element. And in addition, the housing element has a very important role of affirmatively furthering fair housing for all members of San Mateo community in a range of different areas. So in addition to the land use alternatives, of course, we want to plan for circulation and transportation as well. And we have 3 circulation alternatives. These are not broken down by study area. They're citywide because, of course, the city's transportation network is a holistic system. All of the circulation alternatives assume bicycle improvements consistent with existing city planning documents. And all of the circulation alternatives could be tailored to fit whatever the preferred scenario is. So let me go through them briefly, one by one. Circulation alternative A is prioritizing a walkable city and prioritizing pedestrian corridors, pedestrian improvements to challenging intersections, traffic calming, especially near highway on-ramps, and a 2-block pedestrian only street downtown. Alternative B, about prioritizing regional connections and to increase and improve transit access, especially east-west transit connections, and including adding dedicated HOV or bus lanes and bus rapid transit to El Camino Real. And then finally, circulation alternative C combines many of local and regional improvements in alternatives A and B. It would create a pedestrian focused car light space downtown. That's based on a super block system in places like Barcelona, and potentially explore an autonomous vehicle shuttle or other types of future transportation technologies like on-demand rideshare service. One thing to understand is that in combining all of these improvements that focus on biking, walking, and transit, rather than prioritizing single occupant cars, that is that we have to make some trade-offs within the existing right-of-way of a given roadway. So that's kind of most likely to mean that in some places, you might have to remove parking spaces or turning lanes or other features of the roadway that right now are dedicated for cars in order to make space for some of these other types of improvements that are considered in circulation alternative C. We're going to ask you some questions about that in our interactive polling later on in this meeting. But now it's time for your questions and answers. I've just shared a lot of information. Just a reminder that as you have questions, please use the chat function. I know some of you have already started to send in your questions, so that's great. That's very helpful for us. And we will do our best to answer questions, whether that's from me and PlaceWorks or from city staff. So during this part of the Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And let's see what kind of questions we have so far.
Sure. The first question I received was in regards to the key themes of community input. Was there any feedback on environmental sustainability or the values from the vision statement?
Sure, I'll start, and Zach or others, please jump in if you want to. Absolutely, environmental sustainability has been something we've heard a lot about. I know that's a priority for many people in San Mateo. The city, during the time that we've been working on the general plan, adopted a climate action plan. And there's many other initiatives at the city that are happening to increase and improve environmental sustainability. That slide was certainly a snippet of the literally thousands and thousands of comments that we've gotten through this process as it's been underway since 2018. So we wanted to give a sense of some of the top themes, but I think it's very fair to say that environmental sustainability has been a concern, and you saw that concern expressed in the vision statement. And in terms of the feedback on the vision and values, that was in itself an intensive process with a lot of meetings like this one and other types of community outreach events and online exercise to gather input into the vision and value statement. That's going to live in the general plan itself when it's adopted. So just like all of the components of the general plan, it remains a draft form. I think it's been through a lot of discussion and work already. So I think it's a great guidepost for us, but it's not final because the general plan is not final and adopted yet.
And just to jump in real quick and add to what Joanna had noted, being a leader in environmental sustainability is part of our vision statement. It's definitely a very important theme here and will be addressed throughout the general plan. And definitely this is a question we've heard before, and I think it's important to note this phase of the general plan is focused on establishing our preferred land use and circulation alternative, but by no means are these the only two themes that will be addressed in the general plan. It's just we need to set this up front, and then our next phase will actually be opening it up to discuss the full range of issues that the community is interested in discussing, including environmental sustainability and any other number of topics. So as soon as this phase wraps up, we will be opening that up, and there will definitely be forums to speak to the full range of issues that the city is looking to address.
Okay, the next question is, what types of housing is included in the term unit?
I'll
Yeah,
go
so
ahead
this-
and
Yeah,
go for it,
go ahead,
Joanne.
Oh, well, for this particular focus in the land use element, or excuse me, land use alternatives rather, because of the areas where these are really along transit corridors, around the Caltrain stations, some happening in potentially areas that might transform over time, like out at the Bridgepoint Shopping Center, really all of the units that we're thinking of in the land use alternative would be in a multifamily housing format. The land use alternatives do not foresee single family housing within the 10 study areas. Other types of units are certainly possible in San Mateo, and allowed under the existing general plan, and will continue to be allowed under the future general plan. But for the land use alternatives, we really focused on intensifying with multifamily development at whether it's at 3 stories or over 8 stories as contemplated across the range of the alternatives.
Okay, the next question is, how is transportation for seniors addressed with the circulation alternatives that are proposed?
Sure. So the alternatives, all of the alternatives, as I mentioned, foresee improvements that the city has already adopted in existing city planning documents like the pedestrian master plan, for example. So to the extent that seniors walk or use mobility devices to get around, that's kind of baked into all of the alternatives already. For seniors who would prefer to use transit rather than drive, I think that's probably most emphasized in circulation alternative B. And then, as I mentioned, circulation alternative C combines transit improvements from alternative B and also adds other potential future technologies that seniors might take advantage of, like an on-demand rideshare shuttle, for example. So that's some of the ways that I would say that's anticipated in the alternatives.
And then also building upon our circulation alternative that's selected in our next phase, when we start to look at setting our goals, policies, and actions, we can definitely get into this topic with more specificity and focus, depending on where the community would like to see us address this issue within our broader circulation element.
Great. I'm excited about the potential for more bike lanes in the circulation alternatives. Any idea if these are going to be separated or protected bike lanes or just sharrows or on existing roads?
Great question. And it gives a chance to kind of explain the level of detail of the general plan versus other types of planning documents. So really in the general plan, what we would want to focus on is identifying places where safe and effective bicycle connections would be most advantageous. And again, the city has done a lot of planning for bicycles and pedestrians already, and we rely first on those plans that are already in place. But in many cases, those are kind of at a master plan or the general level. And so for bicycle and pedestrian improvements, when we start to actually build them, those there's a lot of very specific, down to the centimeter type of engineering that needs to go into place to determine exactly how this can fit, how wide it's going to be, where is the edge of it, and what is the facility going to look like. So at the general plan level, when we're talking about a citywide plan that looks 20 years out in the future, it's unlikely that we're going to have that level of detail to say exactly what type of facility it's going to be. But the general plan sets the guidance and establishes the kind of work plan for city staff in doing those more detailed designs in the future as the general plan is implemented.
Which plan contains more infrastructure for car alternatives, such as bike paths and transit?
The circulation alternative that kind of has the most improvements for alternatives to cars would be circulation alternative C. That combines the kind of pedestrian focus of alternative A plus the transit focus of alternative B into a single alternative. And again, what that means is that that would imply the greatest amount of change two existing roadways, because we now need to share not only with bikes or not only with transit, but with both bikes and transit. And so alternative C represents the greatest deprioritization of space for cars.
Are there plans for fast charging facilities for electric vehicles?
That's a great example of the kind of thing that would be kind of addressed at the policy level of the general plan to support that type of infrastructure. I'm pretty sure that that is a strategy in the adopted climate action plan. But in terms of, exactly where those charging stations are located, how many charging stations are at each location, what type of charging stations they are, et cetera, that's a level of detail that is beyond what we get into in the general plan. But that as a concept, that's the kind of thing that can be supported in the general plan.
Where can we look at the details of the land use and circulation alternatives?
Great question. Thank you so much. And I am remiss in getting this far in the presentation and not letting you know that we have a website. It's called strivemateo.org. Strivesanmateo.org is where we have all of the information about the general plan. On that website, there are all of our materials from past meetings and the materials for this meeting, including maps of the land use alternatives and the circulation alternatives that you can open on your own computer and zoom in and zoom out. Thank you, Ricky, for placing that in the chat. And in addition, everybody who registered in advance for today's meeting should have received an email with links to all of the material that we're going to be talking about today, including the alternatives and the alternatives evaluation.
How much new park space will be created, especially in areas where more housing is proposed, especially the north central areas?
Yeah. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to the alternatives evaluation, but it's a very important question. As we can all see, San Mateo is what we as planners called a built out community. There's not, we're not like a Central Valley town where there's still acres of open land or farmland around us that we could choose to build on or not, or add a park on. And so it makes it a very challenging question to figure out how to add park and park space as we continue to add population to San Mateo over the coming decades. So one way that the alternatives grapple with this question is by assuming that private development will continue to be required to provide park and open space type of amenities. And that would be part of new development to serve the residents of that new development, and as well as other residents over time as part of the benefits that new development could offer in exchange for the privilege of being built in San Mateo. So that's one way that new parkland can happen. That's the focus of the land use alternatives and the development within the focus areas. North Central is not within one of our 10 study areas. And so we haven't looked specifically at parkland in the North Central neighborhood as an example.
Okay, I have two related questions. I'm going to read them at the same time. I would like to see a tree planting initiative. Redwood City has one as an example. How can residents participate in something like that? The next one is tree cover is too low to support sustainability goals in dealing with the climate changes we are feeling, including heat on city streets and in our homes. Where do we see provisions for increasing tree cover?
Okay, great. So that's an excellent example of a type of topic that we're going to be tackling in the next phase of the general plan update. Again, I believe that the climate action plan touches on this topic, or other city plans. However, the general plan is an important place to provide kind of overarching policy document. And if tree coverage and tree planting is an important priority that we hear about from the community, then that would be captured in a policy and an action in the general plan update and that could go with any of these land use or circulation alternatives. And that's going to be in the next phase. So if you're here today and tree is important to you, I hope you will continue to be involved in the process. I do want to keep us moving so we can get to the other important questions that we have. We're going to have time at the end to come back and answer more questions. I also got a few questions that were directed to me, so let me just go through those very quickly. Somebody asked, what does affirmatively support affordable housing mean? Are there real numbers that go with this aspirational goal? The concept of affirmatively furthering fair housing is a new state law since the last time the city updated the housing element. And it really has to do with analyzing and understanding and working to remedy past patterns of segregation or lack of access to opportunity. There's not specific quantitative benchmarks set in state law. And this is something that all communities in California are being required to look at as part of the housing element. This is not unique to San Mateo, but it's more of a geographical or spatial type of analysis than a numerical exercise in this for that piece of the housing element. Can you explain how the jobs assumption remains the same, but housing levels are very different? Great question. Again, housing was really the kind of the number one thing that we heard about over and over again as we were starting up the general plan process and working on earlier phases. So the general plan, to change jobs would require the city to take efforts either to prevent additional job growth. And I have worked in some communities that were interested in doing that because they felt like they had too many jobs. Some of your neighbors a little bit further south on the peninsula, for example, or to do a lot to increase jobs and try to bring more jobs to the community. We didn't really hear a lot about that one way or the other for San Mateo. So what we wanted to test was scenarios that kind of leave jobs constant and assume job growth more or less in line with existing trends, since we haven't heard a lot from people that they either want to dramatically increase job growth or dramatically decrease or flatten job growth in San Mateo. But that does lead to the possibility that over time, the amount of jobs and the amount of housing in San Mateo would diverge depending on what preferred scenario is selected. And we talk about that more in the alternatives evaluation. So that's those are the questions that I got. And I'm sure some of you have additional questions, and you will as we keep going. So keep using the chat function to submit your questions. Please do send them to Project Questions Carrie, because she's the person who's assigned to capture these, and others of us have other roles in the meeting, and I don't want to miss your question. So with that, let me go back to the presentation briefly. And we're going to we're gonna then have some time to hear from you with an interactive poll. And I'm gonna just give you briefly some instructions for how to do that. So let's see here. This is using a tool that's called Social Pinpoint for audience polling. And you can access the polling tool in one of two ways. Ricky's going to put this URL in the chat, or you can hold up your smartphone to the screen and use the QR code, the little square there. And that'll take you to a website that'll open a separate window on your device. And there's two questions there about the most important circulation issue that the general plan should help the city improve, and the most important land use issue that the general plan should help the city improve. So we're going to give you a second to navigate to that window. And don't worry, we've tested this. It should work smoothly for you. In case you can't get there or you choose not to respond, that's okay. This is not this is not the only source of input. We have many other ways to provide input. So let me stop sharing. Hopefully you've had a chance to use the QR code or click on the link. And then we're gonna put the poll up on the screen so you can see the answers as they're coming in. This is the screen that you'll see when you go to the interactive polling tool. And as responses start to be submitted, you'll start to see those answers show up on the screen. So we're going to give people a little bit of time to put their thoughts in. This could be, you might have one word like trees, or you might have a lot of words about transit or bicycles or electric vehicle charging, some of the things that we've already heard about. You can answer these questions as many times as you want to. So if you have a lot of issues, you can put them in one by one. That's totally fine. And then we'll see individual answers like you can see here. So in general, the red questions are going to be the ones that focus on circulation, which is kind of a synonym in planning for transportation. And blue is really about land use. So responses are starting to come in, and this is great. If you could just scroll down for us, Angelica, and give us a second to look at them. Thank you. So folks are looking for alternatives to cars, protected walking and biking lanes, and accessible routes to downtown, incorporating different modes of transportation that aren't just about cars, nature-based solutions, reducing single car usage, addressing traffic congestion. Support for low and zero carbon transportation alternatives. So that could take a variety of forms. Improving people's ability to meet their daily needs without a car. So a lot of ideas about ways we can get around without cars. Also ideas about improving traffic flow for cars, especially near Hillsdale Mall and the Hillsdale 101 entrance. So those are some of the themes that are coming up in the circulation comments. If we look at land use specifically, folks are interested in pleasing aesthetics in new high density housing, space for public art, museums and theaters that will bring culture to San Mateo, a more vibrant and competitive downtown, especially as compared to other nearby cities. Reducing traffic and increasing tree cover, balancing affordable housing with services for residents and visitors, multifamily housing located near public transportation, parking availability. Again, parking has come up for us many times during this process, parking availability that matches housing and how much housing is being built. I love the idea of more trees. Substantial lack of housing overall, and specifically the lack of housing in the city's most expensive, exclusive neighborhoods. Pointing out that the median price single family home in San Mateo is $1.7 million, which is definitely a big part of the dynamic that's influencing our general plan effort. Again, comments about seniors and the need for older adults to be able to get around safely. That might include through more bus frequency or wider streets for people who are driving, parking garages, and again, concerns about parking supply, enable bike access as much as possible, bus only lanes, offer choices. So I think you can see some of the themes that are emerging about the circulation comments. You can keep providing your comments. We're going to go back to these comments and capture all of them. Of course, I'm not reading all of them right now, but we wanted to give a chance for you to think about your own reactions and to share them with us. So really seeing a lot of comments about alternatives to cars and the need for affordable housing, especially housing around transit and other amenities. So that's great. Thank you very much. A lot of comments around downtown, and downtown is one of our focus areas that we'll talk about when we talk about the alternatives evaluation. All right, so I think that gives you a little sense of it. Let's keep going and move on. We're a little bit behind schedule here, and I want to acknowledge that, but especially because I saw that more than half of you are coming to your first general plan meeting today. I did want to spend a little bit of time with that upfront presentation and Q&A to make sure that we're giving you the support you need to kind of understand and engage in the process. But with that, let's keep going. Then the second part of the presentation, we're going to have another presentation, and then again a Q&A like we did, and then again an interactive polling like we did, and we're going to have a little bit more time after this, is to give you an overview of what we call the alternatives evaluation. So I just explained what the alternatives were, both the land use alternatives and also the circulation alternatives. We created those with a lot of community input and with direction from your city council. And then we've spent the past few months evaluating and comparing those alternatives. And we want to share the outcomes of that process with you. Again, the full alternatives evaluation document, which goes into a lot more detail than I'm going to go into in this presentation, is available right now on strivesanmateo.org. You can see that at the bottom of every slide. And also was emailed to those of you who signed up through Eventbrite for this presentation. So there's a lot more to it than I'm going to talk about today, and I hope if you're interested, you can continue to go in more depth in the evaluation itself. This is going to be a high-level summary. The alternatives evaluation looked at the topics that you see here on the slide, including several different aspects of urban form, height and density, the ability to meet the future RHNA, that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation, and that's a piece of the housing element if you've been following that process. Jobs housing balance, something that some of you have asked about, and impacts to historic resources, which I've heard from many people is important in San Mateo. It also looked at different impacts to the traffic and multimodal network, community services like police, fire, library, and schools, utilities, specifically water, wastewater, and stormwater, environmental sustainability, again, something that's already come up here this morning, and especially looking at how climate change might affect San Mateo and these different alternatives in the next 20 years, from sea level rise, flooding, or wildfire risk. We looked at equity and public health, both inside and potentially outside the study areas as those areas change. The fiscal sustainability of the city, which means how these alternatives would affect the city's annual operating budget and costs and revenues to the city. The market feasibility of different kinds of development that is contemplated under the land use alternatives. And then the potential for these different land use alternatives to offer the opportunity for community benefits for San Mateo. And all of these topics were based directly on the questions and concerns that we heard from residents throughout the process about the future of San Mateo. So when we look at the circulation alternatives specifically, what we compared the land use alternatives when paired with the different land use, the circulation alternatives compared with different land use alternatives. And the biggest benefit for circulation alternatives comes with land use alternative C. Land use circulation alternative C, the one that combines pedestrian, bicycle, and transit improvements, paired with land use alternative C, which is the alternative that has the greatest amount of residential growth, had the highest benefit of shifting the most people out of cars, to walk, bike, or take transit. When we look specifically at the pedestrian network, again, all of the alternatives include adopted city plans to improve bicycle and pedestrian networks. Circulation alternative B is more heavily focused on transit alternatives and therefore includes fewer additional pedestrian improvements than either A or B. Again, circulation alternative C had the highest pedestrian benefit because it includes the most robust program of downtown traffic calming or street closures to create car light and pedestrian focused areas and other types of public realm improvements that would create pedestrian benefits. For bicycles specifically, circulation alternatives A and C had the most bicycle benefit due to public realm improvements on El Camino Real for bikes specifically that are not included in alternative B. But circulation, oh, this looks at transit too, but circulation alternatives B and C had more of a transit benefit. They add transit coverage from a new east-west transit connection, and they also improve transit service north and south on El Camino Real. So now I want to talk briefly about a metric that we use a lot as planners that's called vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. This is becoming a pretty common indicator to quantify the amount of motor vehicle use in planning. And that means the total number of miles driven per day by people driving to and from San Mateo. So that could be for any reason. It might be someone driving to work in San Mateo, someone who lives in San Mateo and drives elsewhere to go to work or school, shopping trips, trips to visit your friends, trips to your kids' soccer game, all of those kinds of trips are, if they begin or end in San Mateo, those would be captured in the total vehicle miles traveled. If I drive, you know, from here out to Tracy for work, or if I just drive a couple blocks to the shopping center. So in general, areas that have a diverse land use mix with a lot of different, you know, homes, shopping, jobs kind of close together, those areas tend to generate lower vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, than your more kind of typical suburban areas where there's a very clearly residential area, and then that's separated from a shopping center or an office park over here. And so as you can see on this slide, land use alternative A would result in the lowest total VMT, that's this column. So an increase from 2.9 million VMT to 3.3 million VMT under alternative A. But it has the highest VMT per capita. So for each person that's driving, they're driving farther under alternative A than under the other alternatives by a small margin. So alternatives B and C have a higher VMT, and this is because there's more people under alternatives B and C. Again, alternative A has the lowest amount of residential development. B and C both have higher residential development, you know, an increase of about 5,000 more units under B and C. So it's not surprising that we see that those have higher VMT, but they have a lower VMT per person because each one of those people is a little bit more likely to choose other modes than driving to get around, and they may have more options under circulation alternatives to get around without using a car. And all of the alternatives, as you can see here, would have a lower VMT per person than we have right now in San Mateo. So the VMT per capita goes down from 16.5 to 14.5 or lower. That means that in 2040, we expect more people to take options other than driving, therefore decreasing the VMT per capita. And as I said earlier, when we talk about input we've heard so far, traffic congestion remains a concern in San Mateo. We've heard that loud and clear throughout this process. So one way that we can look at congestion is by thinking about average speeds. So this is the average speed on the entire roadway network, all of the roads in San Mateo put together. The small little neighborhood roads that connect from your neighborhood to El Camino Real itself, the highway on-ramps, all of this. It does not include the, it includes all of the key roadway segments in San Mateo that we looked at. So this is kind of system-wide daily average speeds over the course of the entire day. And then peak hours for the morning kind of commute hour, or what we at least used to think about the commute, and the PM peak hour when people are going to work and school and then coming home and running errands in the evening. So again, alternative A has slightly higher average speeds than alternative B and C. And again, that's because alternative B and C would bring more people to San Mateo overall, and also slightly higher average speed. But this trend kind of flattens out. There's less of a difference between B and C than there is between A and C, because under land use alternative C, it affects the jobs housing balance and how many jobs and how much housing is in San Mateo and how many people therefore need to drive to get to their jobs or go farther away to get to their jobs. So again, yes, a decrease in average speeds under all of the alternatives. And this is a metric that's really focused on cars and driving, as opposed to other metrics that look at bicycling or transit. But cars and driving will remain part of the environment in San Mateo, and we want to look at that and understand that. So let's turn to land use alternatives. When we did this evaluation, we actually found that for a lot of the topics that we looked at, the difference in the land use alternatives, while to us it might seem pretty drastic, does not make as much of a difference in the outcomes for these topics. So for the wastewater system and the stormwater system, we believe that with some important changes, all of those all of the land use alternatives could be accommodated. Sea level rise, flooding, and wildfire risk are very serious concerns, especially over the next 20 years. We expect that those impacts may get worse in San Mateo, but the differences among how those impacts would affect the different alternatives was not a huge difference. There is an existing and potentially increasing parkland shortage in terms of what the city has established for itself as a desired goal for parkland acreage per person. More development could allow, under alternative C, could allow for a greater possibility of creating new parkland as part of new development. So although alternative C adds more people, it also adds the potential for greater opportunity. Whereas alternative A would add fewer people who need to use new parkland, but also have fewer opportunities to add new parkland as part of future development. And the potential to reduce collisions, which is really based more on roadway design than on the amount of development, and potential to capture community benefits would really depend on different types of city policies and regulations, again, more so than on the amount or location of development. So for these topics in the evaluation, there may be some nuances, but not a striking difference among the three land use alternatives. Here are some places where we did see differences among the alternatives. In land use alternative A, as I've been saying, that has the least amount of residential growth, it has the lowest densities and the lowest heights of any of the three alternatives. It likely would not meet the city's future housing allocation needs beyond 2031. So there's enough housing planned for in alternative A to meet this existing housing element, but you're going to have to do another housing element in 8 years and another one 8 years after that. And the capacity to meet whatever the requirements might be of those future housing elements are not here in alternative A. So the city would need to undergo another planning process in or close to 2030 and able to be able to show how to meet more housing need that we expect to continue to be an issue. There's more employee residents than jobs, so people are more likely to need to drive elsewhere to go to their work in San Mateo. Again, as I said, total VMT is the lowest, but per capita VMT is the highest. Alternative A has the fewest changes in downtown and in historic districts downtown, and would require the least change to add more police, fire, schools, and parks and library services. Alternative A, because it has the lowest residential development, also has the fewest new affordable housing units, which are required as part of new residential development. Alternative A has the lowest city revenues, but it also has the lowest city costs. So it's most likely to have the largest annual net fiscal surplus, although all three alternatives resulted in a net annual fiscal surplus for the operating budget. So let's look at some of those same topics for alternative B. Alternative B is in the middle of the residential development. It does have increased heights and densities over alternative A spread across the study areas. It has more of an ability to meet future housing need beyond 2031, but there's not a lot of buffer there. The market feasibility analysis found that the kind of mid-range densities that are dominant in alternative B are kind of the best match for where the market is right now today. And so perhaps the greatest feasibility under 2022 conditions. It balances jobs and employed residents. It has more VMT, vehicle miles traveled, than alternative A, but a higher VMT per capita than alternative C. So again, kind of in the middle there. Alternative B would allow the greatest change in historic districts downtown. And in terms of public services, affordable housing units, and the net fiscal surplus, it's right in the middle of the range between alternatives A and C. And then finally for alternative C, again, as I've said, has the highest amount of residential growth, including the highest densities and heights, mostly concentrated around the Caltrain stations. Because of that, it's the most likely to be able to meet the city's future housing allocations. It has, again, the highest total vehicle miles traveled, but the lowest vehicle miles traveled per person. There is a relative balance between jobs and employed residents. Because of adding the most new residents, it would require the most change to increase police, fire, schools, parks, and library services. It would also add the greatest number of affordable units. Land use alternative C would be expected to add the most revenue for the city, but because of the additional residents, it also increases costs. And so it has the smallest net fiscal surplus, although it does still show the potential for an annual surplus in the city's operating budget. In terms of the market feasibility, the higher heights and densities, and especially the requirements that would be implied for parking and underground or structured parking to meet the amount of parking supply needed is very expensive. And so right now, under today's market conditions, those heights and densities are less likely to be feasible than some of the more mid-range heights and densities in alternative B. We can only look at today's market conditions because that's what we have data about. It's possible that over the course of the 20-year life of the general plan, as we plan ahead for the future and set the table for development, that those market conditions, of course, we expect they can and will change. And it's possible they'll change in a way to make the greater heights and densities of alternative C more feasible over time. Speaking of heights and densities, I wanted to just introduce you to an online model that we have that helps show you some of the differences among the land use alternatives. And this comes with several caveats, so bear with me here. This is a GIS tool that is intended to help show the potential kind of envelopes of buildings that might be allowed under the different alternatives. So these shapes do not show buildings. These are not buildings. I want to be really clear that no individual projects have been proposed under any of these land use alternatives or under the general plan. Of course, there's projects that are underway in the city right now, and we've tried to make sure that we're aware of those. But in terms of new proposals, these are not reflecting any specific proposals, and they're really just kind of our imagination about which parcels might develop or redevelop. So there's nothing specific. These don't represent actual plans, but they might give you a sense kind of in 3 dimensions of the possibilities for change over the 3 land use alternatives. And that's what they're intended to do. The different colors represent the different land use categories. Those are on what we call the place types menu. That's part of what was in the packet of materials for this meeting. So this is really intended to show potential height and massing within selected study areas. This is a very intensive effort. Not every study area is represented, or not the entirety of every study area, but we wanted to pick a few locations throughout San Mateo to give you, again, a little bit more sense of what this means in 3D. And when you go to the tool online, it's available at strivesanmateo.org. You can use your mouse or your trackpad to kind of fly around in the model. You can change your vantage point. You can look at the different alternatives from different angles and perspectives, from the street or from above or from the north or from the south. So I encourage you to play around with it and explore the alternatives online. And I hope that is useful to you. So with that, it's time for our second round of questions and answers. Again, I've kind of thrown a lot of information at you, and I appreciate you for bearing with us here. Again, please use the chat function and send to project questions, and Carrie will help MC the questions so that we can get those answered for you. We're going to spend a few minutes answering some additional questions that have come up, and then we'll go back to another round of the polling tool where you'll have a chance to share some of your reactions to the alternatives evaluation.
All right, this group is interested in VMT, so I'm going to read several questions about that.
All right, okay, VMT is complex. Let's talk about it.
For circulation alternatives A and B, does total VMT include the VMT of people who would otherwise live in San Mateo but can't under those alternatives? For example, they're still generating VMT just elsewhere instead of San Mateo.
Sure, it's a great question. The way that we build computer simulations or models to try to capture and understand future transportation patterns and impacts, we have to kind of choose a universe. We cannot look at everything everywhere all of the time. So the universe of VMT that we look at for San Mateo is any trip that begins or ends in San Mateo. And we look at the entirety of that trip. But if someone today is, working in Oakland and living out in Lathrop, that person's not going to show up in this model. Who will show up in the San Mateo analysis is someone who works in San Mateo and has to commute from far away because she can't afford to live in San Mateo. So if she has to live somewhere less expensive, that's farther away, and drive, an hour and a half to get to San Mateo every day, if she's coming to San Mateo, that trip and those miles are in this analysis.
Okay, the next question is, which of the VMT metrics, total versus per capita, is a better metric for environmental impact evaluation?
Well, if you follow environmental regulations in California, you might know that several years ago, the state declared that for environmental impact analysis, what we used to look at, which was called level of service, and really looked at an intersection by intersection basis of traffic congestion, is no longer a valid metric for the environmental reviews that are prepared under the state environmental law of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, because that really prioritized cars over any other modes of transportation, and it increasingly was inconsistent with state level goals about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change impacts. So we do look at VMT now because that gives a more comprehensive view of how many people are driving and how far are they driving and how can we change that number. But the state did not dictate whether you have to look at total VMT or per capita VMT, or exactly how a VMT should be calculated. So each jurisdiction looks at those numbers differently based on the specific needs and the specific issues that they're trying to solve. And I think you can argue both cases, and that's why we presented the information in both ways. Total VMT is important. There's more people driving, there's more VMT. But per capita VMT is also very important to understand too, because that allows us to understand how, even if there's a total number of more people driving, there might also be more people taking other modes. And that might happen in part as a reaction to increased congestion from more people driving. So in a way, the more people drive, the more people choose to take other modes because driving becomes less and less convenient. So both are important.
All right, what data is used to calculate VMT?
The traffic analysis or transportation analysis for this alternatives evaluation is based on the city's traffic model, which again is a computer simulation of transportation patterns in the city. And it's based on the amount of residential and job development that's going to be in San Mateo in the future, as well as, on top of existing development. And it's embedded in a larger simulation or model that includes, that's maintained by CCAG, the City County Association of Governments in San Mateo County, and includes the 9-county Bay Area and beyond.
Do the metrics like VMT quoted for land use alternatives A, B, and C factor in that many more San Mateo residents work from home since 2019 and will continue to do so?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that we're struggling with a lot in the planning field, how to predict and guess about the really unprecedented changes that we've all been living through under the COVID pandemic. So the current traffic model, as you saw, is based on a baseline year of 2019, back before the pandemic. And it does not include significant changes for working from home, even though we know that a lot of people are working from home now, because we don't want to overestimate how many people might be working from home 10 years from now, 15 years from now. This traffic model looks at a horizon year of 2040. So by 2040, what we've said in the evaluation is that we expect that a lot of things that will happen by 2040 that we can predict, and probably some more things that will happen by 2040 that we can't predict. That's true across all of the topic areas of the evaluation. We have to make our best guess. And we think that by 2040, in terms of working patterns specifically, there will be other changes to the system. There will be other changes to our economy. We're making our best guess about what those patterns will be. And they're not necessarily based on an assumption that everybody's going to be working from home 20 years from now, like we are at the moment. I think that is probably an overestimate of driving. And I think for a lot of times in planning, we want to try to overestimate or be more conservative rather than make an overly optimistic assumption.
These next two questions are about average traffic speed, so I'm going to read them together. Why do the peak hour speeds go down so much from existing? Also, what did the alternatives analysis assume for trip generation? For example, travel like pre-pandemic? And the second question is, even though it's forecast that more people in San Mateo will take public transportation by 2040, traffic speeds still decrease by over 50%?
Yep. Yes, and we want to be really transparent about that. And the primary reason is because all of the alternatives assume that there will be more people living and working in San Mateo. So even under alternative A, there would be almost 11,000 new homes in San Mateo and almost 15,000 new jobs in San Mateo in 2040, above what's here today. So when you add that many more people living and working in San Mateo in the year 2040, we do expect that that will increase traffic on San Mateo roads, even though many of those people will choose to take transit or bike or walk. There will be a total net increase in the number of people who are driving in San Mateo. And that leads to the estimates that you saw on that slide.
How many cars will be added under alternative land use C since 50,000 people will move here?
Sorry, can you say that again, Carrie? I didn't hear the first part.
How many cars will be added under land use alternative C since 50,000 people will move here?
Oh, right. There was a question about trip generation. Trip generation is different for, all sorts of different types of land uses and jobs. So we have different trip generation from single family homes than multifamily homes, different trip generation for retail versus office versus industrial types of land uses, different trip generation for mixed uses. So there's not one answer about how many cars would, I mean, there is an answer about how many cars would be on the road, but I don't have that at my fingertips, or exactly how many trips would be generated. It's really kind of looking at the totality of all of the different types of development in San Mateo.
I'm concerned about future roadway traffic operations. While the evaluation methodology is reasonable and very informative for comparison of alternatives at the citywide level, how will the study address roadway traffic operations going forward?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course. I said earlier that the state kind of prevents us from looking at roadway operations on it for the environmental impact report, but it remains very important for the city to understand how many drivers and other users are going to be in a given roadway and to be able to plan ahead for that. So the general plan does have an important role to play in setting the stage for future roadway improvements. And then those, those roadway improvements, again, kind of like the bicycle improvements that we were talking about earlier, are designed in much more detail as we start to focus on an individual intersection or roadway segment over time as the city kind of goes through its program, its regular program of annual roadway maintenance or other changes. And sometimes those changes are designed in concert with a given individual project that might have a significant effect on a specific roadway segment or intersection. Anyone from the city, I don't know if you want to add more to that, Phil.
I think you covered that one very well. Thanks, Joanna.
Okay, what areas in San Mateo are at measured and known risk of wildfire?
Sure. So we looked at wildfire data from the state of California, Department of Forestry, and those maps, like many different kinds of maps and data, are always being updated by the state. The wildfire risk in San Mateo is highest in the hills to the west of the city. There are none of the study areas that are in a very high wildfire hazard severity zone, but study area 6, which is up by the Laurelwood Shopping Center and by Highway 92, is the part of San Mateo that comes the closest to being in that wildfire risk area. Let's do about 2 more questions right now, Carrie, because I do want to be respectful of people's time and I want to have time for the other interactive polling tool.
Sure. Is protection and reuse of historic buildings in the downtown historic district addressed in alternatives? Isn't this part of sustainability?
Great question. And we've heard throughout the process that historic resources are really important to people in San Mateo. And the downtown includes a historic district and other individual historic buildings that are not part of a district. There's other historic districts kind of immediately adjacent to downtown. So the boundaries of those historic districts are included on all of our land use alternative maps. And the land use alternatives don't include changes within the downtown historic district itself. But they do look at different ways that downtown might change, including kind of immediately next to the historic districts. So in the evaluation, we looked at the probability or possibility that the different land use alternatives would have different impacts on those historic districts. Individual historic districts and resources, of course, are protected by state and federal laws. So individual projects that might propose a change to or immediately next to a historic resources would be subject to those regulations. And there's always a tension between deciding, how much we want to change and evolve versus how much we want to preserve. And the land use alternatives to look at kind of 3 different possible ways that might happen.
Which alternative has an ending jobs to housing ratio closest to 1?
It's a great question, and we have a pretty detailed numerical analysis of that in the alternatives evaluation. What we actually looked at was not jobs, not housing per se, but jobs as compared to employed residents, right? Because a lot of people live in houses in San Mateo. Some of them are children, some of them are retired, some of them are not in the workforce for other reasons. So what we like to compare is how many jobs are there in San Mateo versus how many people in San Mateo who work. And actually all of them over time, including both existing development and projected future development, are relatively close to 1. But if I remember correctly, I think B comes the closest to 1. There were not extreme differences between the employed residents and the jobs across any of the 3 alternatives, but there were some slight differences. So I encourage you to take a look at that section of the evaluation if this is a particularly important topic to you. So I know that we may not have gotten to all of your questions, and I'm really excited that you have so many questions and that you're so interested in this. It's very important. It's also very complex and very detailed. So I applaud all of you for having the energy and the curiosity to stay engaged with this and to digest this amount and complexity of information. It really shows me again that people in San Mateo care a lot about what happens in this community. And I'm really impressed by that, and it makes it a very exciting place to work. I feel lucky to be involved in this with all of you. So thank you. If you do have questions, again, we're going to stay and we have time either to continue the Q&A or maybe to break out into rooms, depending on kind of what seems to be the needs of the people who can stay with us after 11:30. But between now and 11:30, I do want to make time for our second round of interactive polling. And this is going to work the same way as the previous round, but let me go back and show you again the links and the QR code. So this is, again, using our social pinpoint tool. We're gonna be asking you about the alternatives, and now that you've heard a little bit about the alternatives, for the circulation alternatives, are there ideas in the circulation alternatives, whether that's about pedestrian and bicycle improvements or transit improvements, that you think you would want to see as part of the updated general plan? And then thinking about the alternatives overall, the circulation alternatives, is there one alternative that comes the closest in your mind to the right direction for San Mateo? Same questions about the land use alternatives. What ideas from the land use alternatives? Again, you can mix and match when it comes to the land use alternatives. So you might like one idea, or you might like one study area from one alternative and something different from a different alternative, and that's great. Or there might be one land use alternative that really speaks to you. I know in some of the earlier comments, we already saw people saying, I like alternative C, I like alternative B, and that's okay too. And, you know, also we want to think about the risks that San Mateo is going to be focusing, especially the climate risks. We've heard in this conversation already about environmental sustainability. To you, what's the most important or most critical, rather, climate risk that you would want to see the general plan address? So these are the questions that we're going to be answering. Those questions are available for you in the tool itself, but I just wanted to kind of give you a preview. Let's hop into the tool and see what kind of responses are coming in so far. 5 questions here, so we can spend a little bit more time on this. Folks are already hopping in with their favorite alternative. Thank you so much. Again, you can answer all of these questions. You can answer any one of them more than once. When we look at the preferred circulation scenario, that's going to be these orange boxes. Alternative, we've got a lot of answers in favor of circulation alternative C so far. When we add circulation ideas, we worry about transportation for those living in the hills. And it's true that we have a pretty decent north-south connection network already, and some planning for that in the future, but east-west, getting people down from the hills is more of a challenge, and people want to see that addressed in the general plan. Again, support for pedestrian and bike improvements, even pedestrian and bike only streets. So changing our focus to look at land use ideas, people are interested in dense multi-use buildings with retail on the bottom and housing above, choosing the land use alternative that builds the most housing, Alternative C, more dense housing, please, more affordable housing. Rehabilitating underutilized shopping areas, which is definitely part of the study areas that we looked at in these three alternatives. Again, support for alternative C as the land use alternative. So let's look at maybe some of the land use ideas that people might be responding to. Services should be addressed. Rehabbing underutilized shopping areas again. Placing jobs and housing near transit. Thinking about hospitals, doctors, and medical care, definitely an important part, obviously provided by the private market, but the city needs to be a partner in making sure that there's space for those critical medical needs in the community. Great. Any critical risks coming in so far? Let's see if folks are thinking about that at all. Sea level rise is the most critical systemic risk for the city. Obviously very important with San Mateo being located right along the bay shore. Thinking about not only, surface water, but groundwater intrusion potentially. Wildfires in the hills from the other side of the city, also a risk. Future pandemics. We're living through one now, but we could be facing other pandemics again in the future. Sea level rise, climate change, earthquakes, and even technological or human caused changes like AI, artificial intelligence, and threats to privacy and democracy. So yes, I think many of us feel that we're living through times a lot of different challenges, and it's definitely a tall order for the general plan to respond to these. A lot of consensus among the group who's here this morning about circulation, alternative C as the kind of being the closest to the right direction. Some people would add more parking structures in alternative C to make sure that we have more parking for all the folks who are going to be living and working here in the future. This is land use alternatives, alternative C, alternative B, alternative A, a little bit more diversity. I think the most voices supporting land use alternative C, but also some folks speaking up to prefer alternative A and alternative B when we look at the land use alternatives. I'm getting a question about whether or not these survey tools will continue to be available after this session ends. And that's something that we can talk to city staff about. We originally created these just so that we could do this kind of real-time interaction with you in the virtual workshop format. We do have another online survey that is available and that's going to continue to be available. And that kind of has a lot of the same questions, but actually offers you the opportunity to go into even more depth. So let me just give you a little bit of a preview of that. Another possible way to share your feedback. This is great feedback. We're capturing it all. We're going to go back to the last couple of slides of the presentation now, since we're just a little bit past 11:30. But we are capturing all of that, even though we're not showing it to you on the screen right this second. You can continue to submit your feedback. Oh, I forgot to tell you how to give useful feedback, but you did it anyway. Smart. Okay. The online survey is going to go into more detail. Again, it's available right now at strivesanmateo.org. And it will offer an overview of the alternatives, both circulation and land use. It'll offer you links to the entire alternatives evaluation and many other resources. And it's a place for you and others to share your input. I know that not everybody can take time out of their Saturday to be with us. But if you know people who care about the future of San Mateo and who want to share input, this survey is going to be a great way to do that. So please visit strivesanmateo.org. It's a little bit different format from the survey that we've been using in this workshop, because we want to provide you with resources like maps and documents that you can use. So let's see, Ricky, go ahead and post the survey link in the chat for us here so that people can use that if they want to give more input and share with their friends and neighbors. That survey's online now, and it's going to be live for more than a month through March 7th. So you can find it easily at strivesanmateo.org. And there's a link directly to the survey as well. If you continue to have questions and comments that you want to offer outside of the survey, please email us at generalplan@cityofsanmateo.org. We're actually doing another one of these workshops just like this on Thursday night coming up this week. So that's going to be Thursday the 27th in the evening. And if you want to do all this again and get more questions answered, or if you know folks who you think might be interested, we're going to be doing that again on Thursday evening. We found that sometimes weekday evenings work better for some folks and Saturdays work better for others, so we try to do both. It's going to be this same meeting. And then we're going to go to the general plan subcommittee and get their feedback. We're going to have 2 sessions with them to work through this intense amount of information. First on Thursday, February 17th, and then 2 weeks later on Thursday, March 3rd. Both of those are at 6 p.m. Those are going to be virtual meetings. The public is welcome and encouraged to attend. And there's always time for public comment on those agendas. Same with the Planning Commission. After we talk to the General Plan Subcommittee, we're going to be going to the Planning Commission on Tuesday, March 22nd, and then to the City Council on Monday, April 18th in the evening. Again, public meetings, public comment is included, and we'd love for you to be there and join us for those discussions as well. Keep track of all of these meeting dates and times on strivesanmateo.org. Again, we're going to stay for a few more minutes to either answer more questions or go into small groups, depending on who stays and how many of you are interested. But if you're leaving now, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks very much for your time. We would love to hear from you about this workshop. I know we're asking a lot of you today, but we always want to continue to improve and do better. So this is a slide to a brief survey, 4 or 5 questions about your experience today to let us know what went well and what you'd like to see done differently in the future. If you have a few minutes to share your feedback with us, that's very valuable and helps us do a better job. So thanks for that. And if you're staying, you'll have another chance to see that slide and offer your feedback. So let me stop the screen share now. Let's take a sec and see how many folks are sticking around. My sense is that there's still a lot of us here, which is awesome. And I think that at least at first, folks might be interested in some additional questions and answers. I think there's some questions there that we haven't gotten to yet. So if that's the case, let's see if we can take a few minutes and provide a little bit more information.
Yes, that would be great. I know we still have a lot of unanswered questions. So Carrie, if there's a couple more questions, maybe we can tee up and then kind of see how the group goes. But given our timeline, maybe Q&A, and then we can maybe transition to some unmuting and live questions if we want to.
Thanks, Zach.
Sure. So one question I got that we didn't have a chance for was, how will social and environmental justice and equity be advanced by concentrating more housing in areas north of the central business district, which have long been the repository of housing since the 1960s, rather than other much wealthier low density areas, especially those west of El Camino Real? And sorry, Joanna, a related question is intensifying development in existing R1 neighborhoods being considered, such as allowing townhomes, cottage courts, small condo buildings, etc.?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, those 2 questions are related. And let me start by answering the second one and then talking about the first one. You might be aware that there have been recent changes in state law, especially through a couple of Senate bills called SB 9 and SB 10 that affect the city's ability to regulate development in areas that are currently zoned for single family. So those changes in state law went into effect on January 1st, and they mean that it's now easier for property owners to propose and accomplish both subdividing their parcels if they have a larger parcel, and also then building up to 2 units on a parcel. They can also build accessory dwelling units on a parcel. So it significantly, well, significantly might be too loaded a word. It did increase the ability to add units in existing single family neighborhoods, whether those are accomplished through duplexes or triplexes or accessory dwelling units, granny flats, or junior accessory dwelling units, which is like if you want to add a unit kind of within the footprint of your existing home. So several different new possibilities have opened up due to changes in state law for adding housing within existing single family zoned areas in the recent, just very recently. Zach, I saw you unmute. Do you want to hop in there at all?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in and note to our audience that the city is beginning to study SB 9 and SB 10. I know SB 9 is more pressing, and we will be bringing that before the city council in the near future as a study session, and then working to develop guidelines and an ordinance to accommodate growth and development under SB 9, depending on where the community and the council wants to go with that. So more to come outside of the general plan process to look specifically at SB 9.
Right, and that's another important point to understand. As I mentioned, these are reactions to changes in state law. You know, despite our wishes, the lawmakers in Sacramento continue to change the laws, even while we're already working on our general plan update. So some things are going to happen as part of the general plan, and other things are happening outside of the general plan, and we always have to be flexible to respond and adapt to what happened. There was a question about, so there are potential ways that we could see changes in single family zoned or R1 neighborhoods within the life of the general plan, even if that might be related to changes that are happening outside of the general plan process. There was also a question that Carrie read about changes to residential areas north of the central business district, and I think that's perhaps mostly referring to the North Central neighborhood, although there's other neighborhoods as well in Shoreview. And we got a lot of feedback about this as we were in the process of creating the study areas. And we went through actually a couple rounds of talking about the study areas with the community and with the city council, and checking again, given the pause that was created by the pandemic. And we ultimately ended up with the study areas that you saw earlier today, which exclude North Central and other R1 zoned parts of the community, and focus change in areas that are closest to existing services, whether that's shopping, jobs, schools, parks, transit, etc. So that means primarily, again, along the El Camino corridor and other major corridors, and in the areas around the Caltrain stations, and then a couple of areas farther out at Bridgepoint and up at the Laurelwood Shopping Center, where we think we might see change. And that's where the land use alternatives focus. The alternatives evaluation does include a section about equity and different types of potential equity and public health impacts under these land use alternatives, because again, it's something that we consistently heard concern about from the community. And there's many different ways that these land use alternatives could have different equity impacts. There's certainly been concern in San Mateo about displacement and gentrification. Displacement, of course, can happen when existing homes are torn down to build a new building. And displacement can also happen over time as the cost of living rises in an area. And as the cost of housing rises in an area, people are kind of economically displaced. And the same thing can happen to businesses as well, including small businesses and businesses owned by people of color. which might be more likely to be impacted. So, again, alternative C includes the most amount of new construction, but it also would include the greatest amount of new affordable housing that might have a positive effect on equity. So those kind of impacts are very complex, but we have addressed that in the alternatives evaluation, and I encourage you to take a look there.
All right, how will sustainability be addressed to service the significant population growth projected? Also, is there a requirement for job growth like there is for housing? How did job growth get estimated?
Okay. When we say a word like sustainability, there's a lot of different components to that, of course. So a very important instrument for the city to look at sustainability is the climate action plan that I've referenced a couple of times. That was adopted during the course of this general plan update, I think in 2019. And that is really focused on how the city and its operations can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a very important tool in thinking about sustainability. And we've already been looking at the climate action plan to make sure that we're pulling over the most important strategies and ideas from the climate action plan, and that the general plan will be consistent with that. And of course, there's also other important initiatives like in supporting people in biking and walking, supporting green infrastructure that we're also happening in parallel with the general plan update or exist in other current city planning documents. And we want to make sure we're being aligned with those as well. And then there was a question about the jobs projections. So as I mentioned earlier, we really are basing our jobs projections or using the jobs projections that are based on historic trends and existing conditions in San Mateo, rather than an assumption that we're going to see either a dramatic increase or a dramatic decrease in the number of jobs in San Mateo over the next 20 years. So more or less a projection of the continuation of recent trends, leaving the pandemic aside, because again, we think that that kind of will be less of a dominant influence by the year 2040 than it is to all of us right now.
Okay, I see you looked at the impact of city services, but you have not included health medical needs. Have you evaluated that impact?
Right, that's true. We really focused on services that are provided by the city and the school district. Of course, the city does not regulate schools or provide schools in San Mateo. That's done by a separate school district. But again, we focused on public agency services. And as I think we all know, healthcare in the United States is a very complex set of factors. There is some public healthcare, but a lot of it is provided by the private market. It's not something that the city regulates or can require. It's not provided for the most part by public entities the way that police services or schools or libraries are. So our analysis really focuses on the things either that the city has direct control over or that we know are very important that are managed by other public entities like water or public schools. And we did not focus on healthcare as kind of a separate, complex, and mostly privatized system.
When will height limitations be determined?
So we haven't really talked about Measure Y as part of this meeting. The city has existing voter-approved height limitations in place. And some of these alternatives, especially parts of Alternative B and much of Alternative C, contemplate heights that would exceed those voter-approved height limits. And so if there are height limits in the ultimate preferred scenario that exceed the limits that are in place right now due to voter measures, then that would need to go back before the voters of San Mateo for consideration. So the first step will be to arrive at a preferred scenario, and that's going to happen based on the process that I outlined in the next step slides, where we continue to work with the community, the general plan subcommittee, the planning commission, and the city council to get to direction on a preferred scenario. Even when we have that and we understand the picture land use alternatives and circulation alternatives that we're working with, we still have the process of creating the general plan goals and policies and actions that I talked about very early on in this presentation, and then putting that all together into the draft general plan itself, doing the EIR. So all of that's going to take another couple of years. At the end of that process, we will have an adopted general plan, and that will be the roadmap for the city. And so ultimately the amount of and type of development that's allowed in that final general plan, whatever shape that takes, still very much being determined, that will signal whether or not there are potential changes to voter approved height limits that need again to be considered by the voters of San Mateo.
Thank you, Joanna. I know you've been carrying the lion's share here. We wanted to take a quick transition. We've got about 10 minutes left in our workshop here. So we wanted to give our participants who are still with us an opportunity to ask any additional questions that maybe have popped up as you've been hearing this discussion. So if you'd like to raise your hand, then we can go ahead and unmute you. You can ask your question and then we can provide a response. And then we can work through whatever remaining questions that you have. So I'm looking at our list. I don't see anything yet, but if someone would like to pose a question, go ahead and raise your hand and we can go ahead and unmute you and then you can ask that question. If not, we've still got a few more questions that were submitted that we can provide responses to that way. And then there is on the bottom of your screen, you will see the raise your hand function on the bottom on the right hand side. So that's the button to push if you would like to ask a question.
While we wait for folks to raise their hand or see if that happens, Carrie, is there any other written questions that we haven't gotten to yet?
Sure. Is there a specific definition for affordable housing? Affordable housing in terms of the housing element is defined based on a percentage of what's called the area median income. So that means that it's kind of different depending on what the income is in a different area, and it's different depending on the household size. So those income limits are higher for bigger families and lower for smaller families. So there's not a single number or percentage, but that's kind of the technical definition of affordable housing in terms of the housing element and the housing industry. And, you know, we also, it can be confusing because sometimes when we talk about affordable housing, and I think a lot of times when people submit comments or in this process and say, need more affordable housing in San Mateo, a lot of times they just mean housing that, you know, regular folks can afford. They don't necessarily mean subsidized housing or below market rate housing, but just housing that is affordable, you know, to a person with kind of a middle class income. So it can mean both things depending on the context for the specific the specific term. Right. Do the alternatives have different consequences for the electricity grid? If so, how are these consequences included in the comparative assessments of the feasibility of the alternatives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the electricity grid again is a little bit like the healthcare example that we talked about, where it's absolutely vital to everyday life, and it's more or less a privatized resource. So the utilities analysis and the alternatives evaluation looks at water. It looks at the capacity of the city's wastewater treatment plant, looks at the city's stormwater system. It doesn't look at electricity or the, however, energy use is one of the topics that's required to be looked at under the environmental impact report. So alluded to this, but we haven't gone into a lot of detail about it. The we're going to be required to prepare an environmental impact report, or EIR, on this general plan. And that's going to be an even more detailed, more rigorous analysis of the draft general plan later on in the process, when the plan has been drafted and we have something a little bit more concrete to look at. So there is going to be an analysis of energy as part of that EIR. That analysis did not happen at the alternatives evaluation stage. That was not one of the utilities that we looked at, but definitely an important factor to consider. So thanks for raising that. We haven't heard that yet today.
It's hard to understand the differences between the circulation plans. How do the circulation plans relate to the land use plans? Can we not improve pedestrian, bicycle, transit regardless of the land use plan? Yes, we can definitely improve pedestrians, bicycle and transit circulation regardless of the land use plan. And given the feedback that we've heard here today, I hear a strong interest in doing that. Any of the circulation alternatives can be tailored to match up to any of the land use alternatives or whatever the preferred land use scenario is. So we want to provide that flexibility. But kind of a trade-off there is that we did not at this stage assign a specific circulation alternative to a specific land use alternative. So it's kind of mix and match among the land use alternatives, and also mix and match for the circulation elements as alternatives and how they might integrate with the different land use alternatives. So you're right that there's not a strong connection right now, because we wanted to leave that open for how they might match up depending on the outcomes of this process. But any of the circulation alternatives, whether it's focused on pedestrian and bikes or focused on transit, or trying to find a way to do all of the above, can be matched up with whatever the preferred land use scenario is that comes out of this process. This is a related question, and I think you just answered the second part, but how do we understand the differences between transit options, and are they independent of land use proposals? Right.
Yeah, again, it is complex because it is interrelated. For example, you can understand these a lot better if you take a look at the materials on the website and the alternatives evaluation. We wanted this session today to be a little bit more kind of introductory and offer a high-level overview, but there's more detailed maps available on the website, and there's more descriptive information in the alternatives evaluation. So you can take a deeper dive there. If we think about matching up transit with land use, for example, if we end up with a preferred scenario that has more intense development out at Laurelwood Shopping Center in what's study area number 6, then that would imply to us that we need to include in the general plan some circulation or transportation improvements to connect that area more strongly to the central parts of San Mateo and get people from that area down to transit connections along El Camino Real or at Caltrain, for example. So that's one example of a way in which transit needs to be responsive to the ultimate land use pattern. If instead we end up with development very concentrated at existing Caltrain stations and along El Camino Real, then that would point us to focusing our transit improvements in that central area. So they do need to kind of be responsive to each other and evolve together in parallel.
I am confused with the SamTrans transit changes, which model is integrated into circulation in this. Is it the new or old SamTrans?
It's a great question, and I would have to speak with our transportation engineer to find out exactly which SamTrans plans are assumed in the traffic model or the computer simulation that we used, and get back to you. I don't have that information at my fingertips. But you're right that, and it's another great point, that the city does not control transit in San Mateo. There are other agencies that control transit, whether that's Caltrain or SamTrans, or other agencies. And so we're always kind of trying to make sure that we're doing our best to stay in touch with those agencies, understand their plans, and understand how their plans can affect San Mateo.
As part of the comment regarding parking expense, would increased car alternatives lead to a reduction or elimination of building parking minimums?
Would increased car what? Sorry.
Car alternatives lead
Oh.
to a reduction or elimination of building parking minimums?
Uh-huh. City staff, I know that parking is kind of a perennial issue that we're always thinking about, and calibrating parking requirements is a very important thing that you're already addressing and thinking about, and it's something that we're going to continue to think about in the general plan, but I don't know if you want to address this more holistically.
Yeah, I think parking is one of those issues we are looking at slightly differently. I know there is going to be an increased reliance on shared parking, and I know that often comes in the public realm, either in a parking garage or on the street. And I know one of the questions that we are asking and interested to find out is the trade-offs, because we do have a finite amount of space, say in a public right-of-way on the street, and balancing space reserved for parking versus bike lanes versus pedestrians is an important topic, and it's a challenge. And so it's something we will continue to address and discuss moving forward, particularly in our downtown area, in our areas where we are concentrating growth, how best to ensure that we're still able to provide parking and meet needs to avoid unnecessary impacts, while also respecting larger state law and other trends where providing large amounts of on-site parking and actually even requiring it is getting reduced. So it's definitely a topic that will evolve, and we'll continue to monitor and weigh in on the best way to ensure providing parking while also addressing other needs as well with a finite amount of space.
In my experience, most general plans do not get to the level of detail of providing parking standards. Parking standards are an example of something that usually in most places lives in the zoning code. And I talked earlier about how the general plan kind of provides big picture guidance, and then the zoning code gets into much more detail. So the general plan would, in most cities, is the place where you look for kind of a general philosophy about parking. And then the specific requirements for different types of individual projects are more likely to be found in the zoning code.
Great.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
I was going to say, so we are R1201. So I think we have covered the full spectrum of questions, at least that we have received. I want to thank everyone participating. It was really great to see so many new participants joining us today to learn about the city's general plan effort. We do have another meeting, a workshop coming up next Thursday. If you would like to plug in again or share with other residents and neighbors who have yet to understand or get involved in the general plan process, as well as subsequent meetings as well, and a number of other ways to engage. So once again, the general plan update website is strivesanmateo.org. We'd love to hear further input from you with our online survey, and there's a number of other resources to learn more. And then you can always reach out to staff through the email address if you'd like to talk to us further or have specific questions or comments to share. So we are going to go ahead and wrap up, and look forward to hearing more from you. And please stay in touch with the process as we move through and select our preferred scenario and keep moving forward with our general plan update for the city.
Thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great Saturday, and 49ers.